Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. You're so kind. I called my dear wife last night in Alabama and told her that these wonderful people at this wonderful conference gave me an award. They really think highly of me. And she said, don't tell them that there are many people in Alabama who hope you will remain in California. And I said, they're pretty sensitive and intelligent group. I think they would have already deduced that. Racism has a stranglehold on the throat of this democracy. This democracy has many problems, but racism has a stranglehold on the throat of this democracy. And that has been the case since 1619, when the first slave ship docked at the shores of what is now the Commonwealth of Virginia. And it is such an awful thing that America cannot even face it. There is great denial in this land. When one speaks of racism, one speaks of how far we have come without saying that we have to go just as far. And that this second journey is even more difficult than the first trip. If one mentions that we have a long way to go, it comes almost as an afterthought, without exposition, without explanation. We just don't want to face the ugly truth, because racism is an ugly reality. I mentioned last night what it was like when I went back to my hometown, Selma, Alabama, in 1958 to become the first black lawyer there. I didn't tell you last night that 2 months ago, as Selma was in the process, it is now 65% black, electing the first black mayor ever. I didn't tell you that in the process of that campaign and that election 2 months ago, a Lincoln town car parked in front of my office in the dead of night was firebombed to ashes. Now, this is not 35 years ago. This was 2 months ago. I didn't tell you last night that over the last 40 years, my life has been threatened more times than a Hollywood cowboy. They have threatened to blow up my home, my mother's home, and even my church. And why? Because racism has a stranglehold on the throat of this democracy. I was sitting in my office, and farmer after farmer would come in to tell me about he was nearly losing his land, his small farm. Oftentimes it had been in his family since the end of the Civil War. And that he was losing this land primarily because of the government. And I've been fighting the government so long that I can hardly remember when it was a time that I did not have at least 5 lawsuits pending against the various entities of the federal government, which is like an octopus. And we began to take a look at the situation of these poor farmers. And I expected to find an ugly story. My life is about dealing with ugly stories. That's why I went back home. But I didn't expect to find what was there in relationship to these poor little black farmers and perpetrated on them by their government. They were indirectly being run off the land by people who were supposed to protect them. And then I learned that the United States Department of Agriculture was huge even by government standards. That here was a monstrosity that half the time didn't know whether it was going or coming. And that it had an active presence in every county in the United States. And that it expended billions and billions of dollars to farmers. And that it was granting that money, lending that money in every one of these counties and in the possessions of the United States through what it called local committees. And these local committees were always the richest, most well-connected white farmers in the county. And they decided who got what when, and black farmers didn't. A black farm, in some places, believe it or not, black farmers could only go on Wednesday. And they were being told, we don't have any money, we're out of money. Or if there was a black farmer who was persistent enough, they finally sent him the money, but made sure they would send it after the farming season, too late to plant. And what you did last year affects whether you get money this year. So black farmers were drying up and disappearing. And that is why we filed this lawsuit. And the Justice Department came forward in the courtroom in Washington and announced that it was representing USDA. Now, if that is not a mess, I don't know what is. One huge bureaucracy representing another huge bureaucracy, and all running from the truth. And the court said, well, Mr. Chestnut, are you suing on behalf of all of the black farmers in the United States? And I said, Your Honor, you have it right. And he said, well, how much money are you really talking about? And this is a liberal judge appointed by Bill Clinton. So you can imagine what the situation, well, never mind. Yeah. And I said, Your Honor, we're talking about $2 billion. And the government laughed. And the court was astonished. Had I been representing white farmers, $2 billion would have been sensible and reasonable. But you don't talk about billions of dollars and black folk in Washington. There's a disconnect there, a historic disconnect. And I said, Your Honor, I don't see why everybody is so upset. In Washington, you pay $2 billion for one B-1 bomber. And the Justice Department notified the President of the United States that he didn't have anything to worry about. The lawsuit would be dismissed. The lawsuit was not dismissed. Then they went back and they told the president, well, you don't have to worry about it. The court will never certify a class that includes every black farmer in the country for the last 20 years. That won't happen. It did happen. And then we had two problems. The first problem we had was that farmers, black or white, brown, whatever your color, don't keep records. They're not notary publics or lawyers, they're farmers. And you can't win a civil rights lawsuit without documentation. So we had a huge problem. We had a second problem because of the statute of limitations, which said that if you bring in a civil rights action against USDA, you must do it within 2 years of the act you complain about, or else you are barred from life. You're barred for life from bringing such an action. And none of these farmers, well, 95% of these farmers would go out under that. So we had to go back to the 1960s. We had to go back to what Terry just got through telling you about. We decided to bring all of the black farmers we could to Washington. And they came. They came in pickup trucks 20 years old. They came in 25-year-old beat-up automobiles. They had these little brown paper sacks with cold chicken, and they slept 5 and 6 in one room in a Motel 6, but they came. One fella brought his mule, the ugliest mule I have ever seen in my life. And the mule was large as an elephant. And the mule's name, believe it or not, was Trouble. And we decided to shut the nation's capital down. And Vernon Jordan, my classmate of Monica Lewinsky fame, and very, very close to the president, told the president, said, you need to do something, not merely because Al Gore is about to have a miscarriage, said, but you need to do something because I know JL. And the President of the United States said he had 30 minutes he would meet with the farmers. And he met with them 3 hours. And he said, in order to solve the statute of limitations problem, I will have to get my friend, the speaker. I said, your friend? He was talking about Newt Gingrich. And he said, the speaker and I are great buddies. And he called the speaker. And from that conversation, I think they were. And we were told to go up the next day and meet with the speaker. And we went up, and the speaker was beside him, said, come in, come in, come in. And he said, you know, we paid the Japanese, and what we've done to you is wrong. We should pay you. I was astonished. And Mr. Gingrich had 2 paragraphs drafted, and they were inserted into the huge omnibus federal budget, just hid way down there, which waived the statute of limitations. And again, my dear wife said, I said, wonder, why did Mr. Gingrich do that? And my wife said she suspects that on every block in Mr. Gingrich's congressional district, a new post office building is going up. I think the lady is cynical. I think he did it because he saw wrong. I think he was sincere. Because the black farmer's story is one that will bring tears to your eyes. But we got the statute of limitations problem resolved. We still had the problem of not having documentation. So we sat down with the government, and to make a long story short, we at last reached a consent settlement. The government had been trying to settle this case from day one, and I was the only lawyer, the only black lawyer there, and I was the only one insisting that it not be settled. I didn't want it pushed under the rug. I wanted this tried in open court so that you, the American people, could hear and see what the government had done to these poor black folks. But at a time, it seemed not in the black farmer's interest to just try that case. The government would be appealing it up to Clarence Thomas and everybody going forever. So we reached a settlement whereby a farmer who had no documentation, no papers whatsoever, if he signed a declaration and had one non-family member to sign a declaration that he had applied for a loan and had been discriminated against, he was entitled to a $50,000 payment immediately. The government would pay another $12,500 as taxes on the $50,000 under his Social Security number and pay it to IRS. In addition to that, he would be entitled to certain injunctive relief to go to the head of the line for the next year, and then there would be a monitor put in place 6 years after this lawsuit shuts down to make sure that he is not discriminated against. Any debt he owed to the government would be immediately forgiven. And we the average black farmer owes the government between $75,000 and $200,000. So the government immediately forgave all of these debts, but that's income to the black farmer. So the government had to write another check to IRS under the farmer's Social Security number and pay the tax on the debt forgiveness. As I speak to you, 8,000 farmers have been paid $400 million. Another 8,000 will be paid in the next 6 months. The government has paid in excess of $100 million in taxes on the $400 million. For those few farmers who had documentation, they didn't have to go into Track A and accept the $50,000. They could have a mini trial in Washington, and whatever they could prove they lost, they would be entitled to it, which means that some farmers went in on food stamps and came out millionaires. It is the largest class action history, the largest class action in the history of this country. And now we have filed the same kind of action on behalf of Native Americans. And the case has been assigned to a judge who is 89 years old, half African American, half Native American. Once we complete the Native American litigation, and the government has asked, let's sit down and settle it, but I'm not going to go for any settlement that's going to last over 6 or 8 months. We're going to have to put some money on the table and get it over with this time. I have learned from the black farmer lawsuit. But after we get through with the Native American lawsuit, we are going to file a suit against the government asking for reparations. And for an apology for federal complicity in 350 years of slavery. Thank you. Thank you. We want compensation for 350 years of slavery and another 100 years of segregation and racial discrimination. We are not asking that it be paid to any particular individual, but we want it to be paid, for example, where it would help these underfunded historic black colleges. Or that it will go into the inner city with some real reforms. And we intend to win. Racism has a stranglehold on the throat of this democracy. And we have to be willing to stand up and fight in order to rid this cancerous stranglehold from around what I think is the greatest experiment in democracy in the history of the human race. We cannot take it for granted. Our enemies are many, well-heeled, shrewd, and some of you would be surprised. Maybe this group wouldn't. But I can remember 35 years ago, so I am not worried about the future. I've been there, done that, and I know we can do it again. I know what happens when people like you join with other people of goodwill. I'm not worried about whether we're going to win. I've been there, children, and I know. The dedication that I have seen here in the last 2 days warms my old heart. I leave here reinvigorated. You have done wonders for me. I'm so glad to know you. I told a group last night about a time in a little church in Marion, Alabama, more than 35 years ago. Cold, raining, and my friend Martin Luther King was there delivering a message, a sermon. We had about 300 people in the church. And the FBI, the Fumbling Bureau of Investigation, came to tell us we had to vacate the building because they had a telephone call that somebody had planted a bomb in or near the church. And we didn't know what to do. You couldn't trust the FBI. If somebody put a bomb, more likely they would be the culprits. But we couldn't risk 300 women and children. Martin was as frightened as I've ever seen him. He was almost white-eyed, great balls of sweat dripping down his cheek. We couldn't know whether this was some ruse just to get him on the outside so somebody could take a shot at him. So what do? It was decided that we would surround Martin with a group of men who would go out a side door while the rest of us went out the front door, all at the same time. And it worked. And we saw white faces across the way, and we saw rifles. But they never got a shot off. They never saw Martin. The very next night, in that little church, in that pulpit, was Martin, completing his message, his sermon. That's dedication. He had learned to control and manage his fear better than anybody I've ever known. He was also the most morbid man I've ever met. You could not talk to Martin 5 minutes and he didn't bring up the subject of death, his and everybody else's. He knew his days were numbered. If he told me once, he told me 100 times. They're going to keep coming back until not one of us is left standing. And he was almost correct. But that didn't stop him. It didn't stop me. It didn't stop the thousands who kept going forward. That's why I'm not worried about what's going to happen in the future. Doesn't matter to me if they elect Gore and Bush. I have been in situations just that bad. But I have found that if you are right, if you are determined, if you are dedicated, then nothing can stop you. I will end by telling you that the young mayor, who's 47 years old, the new mayor of Selma, his father and I were classmates, schoolmates together. And he asked me right after he was sworn in, he said, "What advice do you have for me?" And I said, "We don't want to take your election and turn it into an event to elevate black racism. We don't want to create an embittered white minority in this town without rights. We don't want to set up a court system here based on how you look, how much money you have or don't have. We've been down that road. And I'm happy to report to you that he is a God-fearing young man, and I expect that he will do well. It was just a little over 100 years that guns from the north boomed against guns from the south. Brother fought against brother, father against father, and blood ran in the streets of this nation. And a whole race of people were removed from slavery without education, without the most mundane means of survival. And it has been a difficult and a long, bloody journey. And we, as they say, together have come a long, long way. And we face a long, long journey before us. But we will make it, children, because when good people decide to get up, when good people decide to stand up, when good people decide to look up, when good people decide to reach up, when good people decide to stay up, we can make mountains move, trees tremble. You're a great group. I got to catch a plane. God bless you.